People go missing. You want to find them, but when they're devoured, there's not much left to find. This is Darkness Prevails, the best place to share your true scary stories with the world, because this world is a strange one. Wendigo, an evil spirit that possesses men who consume the flesh of other men, makes them hungry without end. In the woods, they lie in wait, listening for the footfalls of the next person, because only human meat will do. Enjoy these allegedly true stories of real sightings of Wendigo. You can always send me your true scary stories with the links in the description. I'm currently looking for creepy Craigslist stories. Also, if you want to support this channel, think about getting some sweet Darkness Prevails merch, like a This World's a Strange One shirt. Just go to morbidmonsters.com. Now, here are the earliest and most interesting comments from my previous video. Brendan McGee, who has the same first name as me, almost, says, "I aspire to have that sexy voice of yours, Daddy." You don't know what sexy is until you've looked up Nature's Temper on YouTube. M. Lolliot says, "Screw this. I'm installing Instagram now." Something tells me you like to be creeped on. Austin For Real says, "I want to look under my bed after this." Well, Austin, you won't see anything unless you clean up all that used tissue around your bed. Kirby says, "Thanks again, and I love your content. I work as a warehouse coordinator, and you can get bored easily. I just plug in my earphones and listen. Much love from Australia." Thank you, Kirby. Have you had any warehouse horror stories of your own? That would make a good video. And Catherine Towers prophesizes with, "I like walruses." I've never heard of that Pokemon, to be honest. And now, prepare to have your bones licked clean. Not in a weird way. Here are the Wendigo sightings. Number 1. Windigo of Southern Vermont. Submitted by Kvoorhesyt. I'm going to start off by saying that this is a fairly recent phenomenon. My first sighting was in the end of December of 2017, the other just last week. I'm 17 years old and live in a small town in southern Vermont called Springfield. My house is situated on the outside edge of town, nestled in a medium-sized patch of forest. My family owns a pig farm, with only a small fraction of our herd actually being on my house's property. We also have 2 dwarf goats, 4 dogs, and an old pet turkey. Now, getting into the first sighting, I remember it being a little past 8 p.m., so it was well past dark. I was outside at the time, heading back to the house after tossing some garbage in the dumpster. The dumpster was situated just in front of the garage barn, about 40 yards from the house. So about 10 feet from the door, a loud sound catches my attention, making me freeze and turn. I had my headphones in at the time, which just goes to show you how loud the sound was. I turned just in time to see something skinny and vaguely humanoid and pale gray in color. It jumped from the ground to the roof of the garage before quickly crawling to the other side where I could no longer see it. Spooked, I hurried back inside, texting my best friend about what I just saw. For privacy reasons, let's call her D. D trusted me and believed me when I told her. She was just as creeped out about it as well, telling me to be careful. The second sighting was longer and much more terrifying. It was late and dark again, and I was outside with my dog. To my back was a pathway of sorts that led to the backyard, and beyond that, the woods. The path is big enough for vehicles to drive down, and it's not that long of a path. To my right at that moment was a steep drop-off full of trees, the main road at the end of the drop-off. While waiting for my dog to do his business, I was looking up at the night sky, wishing he'd hurry because I was freezing. A loud growl from him makes me look down, He's a very timid dog for his kind of breed, which is why the growl surprised me. He was staring at something behind me, his fur standing on end. His ears were flat against his head, and he was snarling at whatever was behind me. Instantly nervous, I slowly turned, my flashlight's beam landing right on whatever it was. My heart jumped up into my throat, and I could not move. This thing looked to be what had jumped into the garage roof a few weeks prior. It was crouched down onto all fours, almost skeletal thin, covered in short, whitish fur, and staring right at me. Its face reminded me of a bobcat's skull, but much larger. Its lower jaw stuck out in front of its top, its eyes empty sockets. It also had darkly colored antlers sprouting from its head. I could see that its hands, yes hands, were thin as well, and the fingers ended in sharp, black claws. I could not see its feet, as its back legs were partially hidden by a snowbank. We stared at one another for nearly a minute, my dog now cowering behind my legs. It suddenly lets out a shriek that, if I was asked to describe, sounded like a mix between an injured pig's squeal and a woman's scream. The volume of it made me cringe with discomfort. It hissed at me before leaping down into the drop-off, branches snapping. I immediately unfroze, running inside and slamming the door. I felt safer inside, where I could be protected and safe. I once again told Dee about the experience. It took me a few days to do so, but I drew out the creature. The longer I look at it, the more I believe it was a Wendigo. I have a feeling that this won't be the last time I saw this thing. I can't avoid going outside, but I can avoid going unarmed. Number 2. Unknown Entity in the Texas Hill Country. Submitted by Jeffrey K. The entity of San Saba County, Texas. Seriously, I don't know what this thing was, and I'm hoping to gain some insight on what it might have been. I've seen and heard plenty of normal things out there, before and since, but nothing like this. One night on a ranch in the Texas Hill Country, in 2012, I think it was, in the summer, my friend and I took a ride around the property on an ATV, armed with a 410 and a 22 LR, looking for feral hogs and raccoons. It's about a 700 or so acre hunting lease, about a square mile crisscrossed with 2 tracks, wildlife trails, and dry creek beds. The 2 tracks mostly connect to each other. One is irrelevant because it was all reclaimed by foliage. We didn't go there. The other 2 track that doesn't circle back to the main 2 track goes to and along the western and southern fence lines, the farthest parts of the property from the main camp. This area has dense tree cover as well, like no other part of the property. This makes it even darker at night, but not ominous. Not until this night in particular. We had driven almost the entire property without seeing anything but the occasional white-tailed deer, if that. Undeterred, we pressed on to the far trail. We made it about halfway to the southwest corner when we felt the temperature change in the blink of an eye, which it often does, so no big deal. It had already done it at least one other time that night. But then it happened. Out of nowhere, that dreaded feeling of being watched. I'd only felt it one other time, a month or 2 earlier on the main 2 track that is closest to the southwest corner. But back then, the feeling was negligible to the point that I could ignore it. But not this time. This was overwhelming. Both of us felt it. In fact, my friend brought it to my attention before I could say anything. So we stopped the ATV to look around, briefly. We used a big spotlight, and we didn't see anything. Then we heard the snap of a twig. My friend cocked his revolver and immediately pointed it in the direction of the sound, when, out of the darkness, came a tiny baby cottontail rabbit. Yep, that was all. But why would it come toward us? His instinct should have been to bolt away from us. We almost annihilated it out of reflex, not to mention we were a bit spooked by then. Instead of destroying it, we turned around and got out of there, back to camp. This was strange. We never got jumpy like that. We've dealt with other strange occurrences, like a raccoon smacking my friend in the head through our tent the previous winter, among other things. So why was this so different? Why did this bother me so much? We didn't tell my dad about it because we really didn't see anything, didn't even know what to think, but we vowed to return with bigger protection. Now here's where it gets weirder. Months later, we finally had time to return to the property. Naturally, we decided to go back out to that area with a 12 gauge and something else, something bigger than my 22 LR. This time we were on foot. It was night and the sky was clear. We made it about half a mile out of camp, when out of nowhere, there was a downpour, so we had to bolt right back. The second we got there, like someone flipped a switch, it stopped as suddenly as it started. We changed into dry fatigues and set out again. We probably could have made it out there, but we figured it would have just started pouring on us again, so we called it a night. It felt like something was keeping us out of there at night, and it was pretty good at it, as we've only returned by day and saw nothing. Several months later, I ventured outside to that area during the day more than once. Ever since, I stay away from that area. I choose not to venture out there in the middle of the night, but that doesn't mean I won't look in that area's direction when I'm camping out there. I've heard things, weird calls and screams, a gurgling sound. I've seen a silhouette once that looked thin and human, but nothing more. I'd like to take a truck out there one night, but I won't do it alone. I won't go on foot. Whatever is out there, it only comes out at night. I know there isn't a lot to go on. What kind of ghost or demon or creature is this? I've dealt with pigs and raccoons at night a lot, and this definitely wasn't that. But there have been sightings of Wendigo near Austin and Carswell, which is extremely close to where we were, and I believe that Wendigo makes more sense than anything else. Maybe I'll see it one day. Maybe I'll get rid of it before it tries to get rid of me. Number 3. It attacked my horse. Submitted by Elise B. This all started when I was making myself some pasta. I live in a merry little house deep in the woods of Indiana. This makes me pretty isolated, which honestly it isn't really a bad thing. No Jehovah's Witnesses, no door-to-door salesmen. It's a peaceful little place. The nearest house, or any sign of civilization really, is several miles away. My house is near this little abandoned dirt road that goes into the city about 10 miles away, which is sort of a long way to go if you need help or anything like that. But I love being surrounded by nature. Just woods for miles and miles. Behind my home is a big field enclosed by a fence, which is where I keep my horse. She's a big, sturdy old draft horse that isn't fazed by anything, and her name is Andromeda. She's the calmest, bravest horse I've ever known. You could fire a cannon 5 feet away from her, and she wouldn't flinch. She has pitch black fur, save for the little white dots all over her back, like some sort of constellation, which gave her her name. I love to gallop bareback through the forest with her. We've encountered mountain lions, bobcats, and even seen a few black bears, and she hasn't bolted once. Well, not without my say-so. Anyway, it was the middle of winter, and as any resident of Indiana can tell you, it snows a lot. Andromeda has a little barn on one side of the field, which is always open and filled with hay. It's been there for over 70 years. Half of it has already fallen down. It still has a roof though, and that's where Andromeda was when this happened. I was in the kitchen making pasta for myself. I had the water on the stove with the pasta sitting nearby. It was very late, around 9:30. The water was close to boiling, so I was holding the pot by the handle and getting ready to add the spaghetti, when something caught my eye. I have a big sliding glass door in my kitchen that leads outside to Andromeda's field, so that way I can check on her. She was in her barn still, but neighing and shying away from something. In the 7 years I've had her, I've never seen her do that. But something was definitely wrong. She was rearing up on her hind legs, snorting and stamping at something. And then I saw it. There was a large shape in the snow creeping toward her. Mind you, the snow was up to Andromeda's ankles, so this thing was sort of swimming on top of the snow toward her. She couldn't get out of the barn for fear of slipping. But the shape itself, it resembled something like a very large, but emaciated, malnourished wolf. But its movements were not that of a wolf. Its legs were far too long, as was the snout, and there was something on its head that looked suspiciously like antlers. I remember thinking, no, I must be imagining this. Coyotes and wolves don't have antlers. The thing cleared the snow and was now under the roof of the barn. Andromeda was now in defense mode, rearing up to show her sharp hooves. I realized how big this thing was. It must have been 8 feet long, a predator that could easily take down my horse. That thought infuriated me. I was not going to let this thing take my Andromeda. She was my only companion out in these woods. And then I heard a high-pitched whinny from her. She was limping, getting as far away from this thing as she could. I saw a gash across her back. It didn't look too serious, but I was now indignant. I threw on my snowshoes and grabbed the first thing I thought of that could protect me, which was a dull antique Japanese sword that was one of my collectibles. Then I walked outside, immediately forgot how crunchy snow could be. Right away, the thing heard me and faced me. I froze. I remembered I could take down this starving thing with a sword, and that's when it stood up on its legs. It was tall, very tall. It must have been at least 10 feet from head to toe, because it towered over me at twice my height. This wasn't a wolf. It was a deer. Its head was, anyway. And I was not mistaken about seeing antlers. Those were huge as well. It must have been a 16-pointer. But its face was wrong. It looked diseased, as though it had passed a long time ago. Those eyes were horrifying. One was simply a mass of scarred black tissue. The other was sharp and smart. The body altogether was humanoid, but the legs bended like a deer's. Its arms were human-like, only they were extremely long and terribly thin, the hands reaching almost to the knees, fingers tipped with sharp claws. There was a red liquid on those claws that was steaming, and I could see a thin layer of fur on its body. I could sense an intelligence in this strange animal, but I was no less terrified. It raised its head and let out a sound halfway between a scream and a growl. It chilled me to my very core. My knees wobbled, and I almost dropped the sword. Then it charged straight at me. Luckily, the snow was deep, and it wasn't very fast, though this didn't deter it. It pounced from 20 feet away, and I dove to my side, too scared to use my weapon. But something had injured it. Maybe it landed on its body wrong. Maybe it hit something under the snow that it couldn't see. But the next thing I knew, it was shrieking in pain and bounding off into the woods. Both Andromeda and I were extremely shaken. We were both attacked by some sort of horrible, decaying monster. But she was hurt. I came over to look at the wound and she nuzzled me for comfort. The cut wasn't too deep. She'd be able to walk and run. I dug a path through the snow, then I led her back to my house. I put her in the garage where she would be safe and warm, and there I cleaned and stitched the wound. I put a bandage on her, gave her some apples, and she seemed fine. But I knew she'd probably be better off seeing a vet as soon as possible. Lord knows how dirty that thing's claws may have been. I believe what we encountered that night was a Wendigo, a Native American monster that is born in the driest places of the desert. It has a hunger for flesh that cannot be satisfied. It's been a year since then, and we got a proper barn for Andromeda. She's still as sturdy and strong as before, and the cut on her back has completely healed. The next time this thing tries to attack us, it will regret it very, very much. I'll be ready for it. It won't be escaping into the woods alive next time. Number 4. The Woodland Wendigo. Submitted by Declan. I was out late one night, like I usually am. I lived far from anyone or anywhere. Smack bang in the middle of the forest was more so right. It was a thundering night, rain pelting the road as I drove home. My house was one of those fancy logger houses in the middle of the woods, but just a small 2-story shack. The main road curved and twisted through the forest. It was a complete nightmare for me, but luckily I lived down a dirt road. The rain continued as I drove down the road, and soon I came upon my barbed wire fence. I drove into the garage and closed it with my keys in my hands, and that's when I heard the screech. I assumed it was a wild deer or boar getting stuck in the fence. I groaned as this usually was a pain to do. I had to grab my wire clippers and a flashlight, then go free some animal that had stuck itself. I headed into the direction of the screech, the noise lingering for a bit. I soon reached the area of where the fence was, where the sound had been coming from. But oddly enough, it was coming from an open area where there was no fence at all. I flicked on the flashlight and shined it in front of me, and there it was, crouched in the ground, a matted, pale figure, chewing on a deer that must have been too slow to get away. I held my breath as I saw the horrid sight. I slowly crept back. I could hear its deep breathing and munching. Crack. A branch broke under my foot, with my flashlight still shined on the thing. It stopped chewing, then slowly stood up and turned to face me. Its body was mangled and partially decomposed. I could see maggots eating away at it. Its long, lanky arms held the deer by its antlers, but it was its face that got me going, as in running. It was like a deer's face, but just bone with a little skin on it, dark, soulless eyes staring at me. I froze with fear. It screamed at me. Before taking a step towards me, I panicked. I did what I thought I had to and threw the wire clippers at it. I hit it in the chest, making it jump, and the clippers fell to the ground. It screamed. Then I turned and ran as fast as I could. I reached the house, locked the door, and turned the lights off. I hid, panicked at what I just experienced. I peeked through the door window out into the darkness at one point, but I saw nothing. Just a quiet and still night. Ever since then, I've never left the house around dark or ventured out at night around those woods. It was a deer that evening, but it could be me next if I don't watch out. And number 5, Wendigo, submitted by Illya. I grew up in Russia, so of course I didn't know anything about Native American stories or folklore. When it came to cryptids, the most I knew of were Bigfoot and Mothman. When I turned 20, I moved to Utah to start fresh, so to speak. I remember dating this girl who was native, and she told me about these stories and what to do to protect myself from the different entities or different spirits. But back then, I was a skeptic. I ignored it, though I did consider it intriguing, as it was part of her culture. Pretty soon, I bought this property on the outskirts of town. It was about 100 meters away from a forest, and beyond that, it broke off into badlands. I would go hunting and wood collecting in these forests all the time. After about a month of living in this house, I began to notice weird prints in the grass and in the mud. But the thing that got me were the handprints. I shrugged it off, thinking it may have been city kids trying to prank some foreigner. So for a while, I kept it out of my mind. It wasn't until 2 weeks later that I began to notice the footprints and handprints were getting much closer to my house. Sure, it worried me, but I didn't seriously think I was in any danger or anything like that. Weeks went by and there was nothing, so before I knew it, these strange tracks were at the back of my mind. There was a day I'd gone hunting and scored a deer. I brought it back and began to skin it. But all the while I was doing that, there was this strange coppery smell, and it wasn't coming from the deer. There was a direction to it, and it seemed to linger behind me. I even got up close to the deer and sniffed it, and it definitely wasn't coming from that. Anyway, my dog named Kazan, he's an Anatolian shepherd, and I've seen him take down coyotes and badgers easily. He was sitting in my bed and just growling angrily at the window. He did this all night. In the morning, I went outside to see that the deer carcass, the one I disposed of, it had broken ribs and leg bones that had been snapped, like it was nothing, and it hadn't been chewed through. It was broken. I was beginning to feel worried. I asked my girlfriend, and she led me to her elders, and to them I explained my problem. I don't know if they refused to help me for whatever reason, but they said that there was nothing that I could do. After several weeks went by, I decided to go hunting again after getting my courage back up. But the moment I stepped into the woods, literally everything went silent. One moment, the birds and crickets were chirping, and then the next they just stopped. I figured it was because I stepped in the woods and were all checking me out or something. I tried to take my mind off of it. After a few minutes, I arrive at my tree stand and climb up. But that overwhelming smell of copper again, it seemed to surround me. I was practically gagging, and then, a few meters away, I see something. It's sprinting through the undergrowth at a decent speed, then suddenly comes to a dead stop and stands up a good 3 meters tall. It sticks its head up, and that's when I see a skull, like an elk's skull, on its head. It lowers itself back to the ground, then begins to look around until our eyes meet. Instantly, a voice spoke to me in my mind, a voice that wasn't my own. It said, "Run." Was it talking to me? Was it warning me or threatening me? I waited for the monstrosity to step back away into the woods, and once it did, I listened to its command and I ran back home. What I discovered was when I go hunting and bring nothing back, I see the thing on the edge of my property, just watching me. My dog will bark at it all night, but when I do get something, it takes the remains of what I'm done with, but it leaves me alone. I don't know if this is some sort of symbiotic relationship we have, or if it's waiting for something. Either way, it terrifies me to no end. The next time you find yourself looking at your friend's butt and think, I'ma take a big old bite out of that, think again. For one, that's weird, dude, get some help. And two, you could become possessed by a Wendigo spirit. Before you know it, just one butt cheek isn't enough, and you'll be craving the next dozen. Or maybe you'll find Nicki Minaj and never go hungry again. Good night. Be sure to send me your Craigslist stories with the links in the description. Check out my merch store at morbidmonsters.com, and follow me on Instagram at Darkness Prevails YouTube. Thank you all for listening. Stay safe out there, and stay creepy.